Hi everyone. In this presentation, I just want to talk to you briefly about the notion of testing accommodations for English language learners when taking high-stakes tests. So specifically, we know that under No Child Behind and now also under the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA, it's very specific in terms of what it requires. So Title I of the ESSA, I'll read this to you, says it requires the inclusion of English language learners who shall be assessed in a valid and reliable manner and provided appropriate accommodations on assessments administered to such students under this paragraph, including, to the extent practicable, assessments in the language and form most likely to yield accurate data on what such students should know and can do in academic content areas until such students have achieved English language proficiency. Okay, so some of the things that I hope you notice there is it requires that English language learners be included in state high-stakes tests. It requires that they be assessed in a valid and a reliable manner. So as we've been talking about in this course, obviously the fact that they do not yet have proficiency in the language of the test, that can cause many reliability and validity problems. So how do we fix that? Well, according to the federal government, it's very simple. You just provide accommodations. So let's look at what some of these accommodations are, and then let's try to problematize those a little bit. Okay. So first, some of the problems with accommodations. First, it's really up to each state to determine what kind of accommodations they'll provide for English language learners. And most states do not have a very well-conceived policy. And even when they do have a well-conceived policy, sometimes it's not communicated effectively to the individual districts, school corporations, and school sites that are responsible for implementing those policies. Second, not all students benefit from the same accommodations. Okay? So depending on who the student is, what their level of proficiency is in their native language versus in English, and the extent of their prior education, and many, many other factors will determine which accommodations are most appropriate for which particular student. All right, another big issue is many accommodations do not directly address the specific language issues faced by English language learners. In other words, yes, it sounds like a great accommodation, but how is it actually addressing the fact that the student is not yet proficient in the language of the test? All right, and then finally, some accommodations can actually invalidate the test by giving students some kind of unfair advantage over those who don't get the accommodation. So specifically, let's think about some of the types of accommodations that are commonly used, and then let's problematize those a little bit. So one issue or suggestion that was even made in the No Child Behind and the ESSA law was to test students in the language that they know best. In other words, having tests in the home language. So this sounds like a great idea, right? If they're not yet proficient in English, then we'll simply provide the test to them in their native language, and they'll do just fine. Okay, so first, in order for a student to benefit from a test in the native language, they have to know how to read and write that language. Okay, so if this is a fairly newcomer ELLS student and they had been educated in their home country for 2 or 3 more years, where they actually learned to read and write, for example, in Spanish or Chinese or Korean, then yes, we can give them a test here in the United States in that language, and then technically they should be able to do well on that. But let's even problematize that a little bit too. Let's say, for example, that the student learned how to read and write in Spanish in maybe 1st and 2nd grade in kindergarten in Mexico. And then they come to the United States, but yet they're learning mathematics in English, and they're learning mathematic concepts that they've never learned in Spanish before. So even if they were given the test in Spanish, they may not recognize a lot of the mathematical terms because they actually learn those terms in English. Okay? And so we have to think not only just about what their proficiency is like in their language, but what language they've learned different content areas in. Okay? Another specific challenge related to the home language tests too is sometimes they're written in a very formalized version of the language. So they'd be written in a very much a standardized version of Spanish, where the students may speak a more colloquial version of Spanish, or maybe a variety of Spanish that's commonly spoken in the United States and the border regions, but yet is going to be very different from the standardized Spanish that's going to be represented on the test. So those two can also lead to problems. Finally, I'll mention too that it's very expensive to develop tests in the native languages, especially develop tests that are actually good quality, not just simply translations, but an actual parallel version of the test. Another challenge that I'll mention for this is sometimes you have items on an English language test that simply can't be translated. For example, let's say that there's a test question testing the idea of contractions. And so if the student is told, what does its mean? IT''S. And the students have to answer, it means it is. Well, you can't translate that question into Spanish or any other languages because those languages don't have contractions. So therefore, you can't have necessarily just a test that's translated, but you need a test that's parallel and appropriate to the language that is being used. Now, one group that does benefit well from tests in the native language are students who are in bilingual education programs, because those students are receiving instruction in the native language, and therefore we can create tests that do in fact match that instruction, and that would be a very good use of home language tests. All right, another kind of a common form for accommodations is what's called linguistic simplification. And so this is the idea that we can take maybe math word problems that are written in a very convoluted way. Maybe they're long sentences, multiple clauses. And so if we can rewrite that question using simplified English with more simple syntax, then perhaps the students would have a greater chance of understanding it and then showing what they know and they can do. Okay, so this is actually a very good idea, and there's been some efforts to experiment with this. One of the challenges, though, is let's say that the construct that you're trying to test in English language arts is reading comprehension. And so if you're taking complex passages and then simplifying them, we're defeating the purpose of determining whether or not students can read and comprehend complex passages. So linguistic simplification might be appropriate for a science or a mathematics test, but it would be less appropriate, for example, for an English language arts exam, where the complexity of the material itself is the construct that you want to measure. Oftentimes, an accommodation is, okay, the students can use a bilingual dictionary or a glossary, okay, and that's great. Again, in order to use that dictionary or glossary, the student has to be able to know how to read in their native language. And in many cases, English language learners are born in the United States. They go to school, they start learning only in English, and so you can put a dictionary in front of them, but they'll have no idea how to read it. Even if the student is literate in their native language, they have to know how to use a dictionary and how to use a glossary. So the teachers have never allowed the students to use them during regular instruction and actually taught them how to look up words and how to look at the different definitions and figure out which definition is the one they want. Well then, just handing them a dictionary on the day of the test isn't going to do any good. Also, there's some affective issues too. For example, if the student is in class in front of their peers and they're the only one who is given a dictionary, then they may feel very self-conscious about using the dictionary while taking the test. They may also realize that looking up a word can take a lot of time. And again, oftentimes the multiple definitions of a word are not going to be sufficient. Another challenge too is that not all dictionaries are necessarily allowed. And so when you look at state accommodation guidelines, they say, well, we can only have dictionaries or word lists that give an exact translation of the word. We don't want definitions because the definitions might actually give away the answer. And of course, the whole purpose of a dictionary isn't just to give an exact translation of a word, but to provide explanations. And so there are companies out there that do claim that they produce glossaries and bilingual word lists that are appropriate for use. But again, I will also point out that if you've only learned these terms in English and you didn't learn them well, and you don't know those terms in your native language, then a bilingual word list really probably won't be that helpful to you anyways. Okay, another accommodation is oral translation. Okay, this means that if a student is taking the test and they don't understand a particular item, they can raise their hand, teacher can come over, and then if the teacher is bilingual or if you have someone who is allowed to help, then they could translate orally the item for the student to follow. Okay, so again, this sounds great, but again, picture yourself in a classroom with other students quietly taking the test, and are you really going to raise your hand and then have someone come over and start speaking to you in your native language in front of all your English-speaking peers? And so, well, maybe they're doing the test in a small group, and we'll talk about that in a second, where maybe that's okay. But think about a typical math problem, okay, a word problem that's maybe 4 or 5 sentences long, and it's very detailed. You know, Bob went to the store and he bought 5 boxes of macaroni, 2 boxes of cereal, 3 bags of sugar, and so forth. If he has $25 and then the total price is $33, how much money is he short to make these purchases? So if someone were to read that to you out loud, would you be able to do that math problem in your head, even if English is your first language? Okay. Obviously not, because there's too much to remember while it's read aloud. Okay. Also, how good is the person translating it? Are they really translating it correctly? How many times are you allowed to repeat it? Okay. And so just having oral translation isn't necessarily a positive thing. Also, translation can change the construct that's being measured. So again, if it's an English language arts test and it's a reading passage, and if you were to translate the reading passage or translate the questions that are being asked, then we're no longer measuring English language arts or reading comprehension for that matter. We're now testing oral language comprehension of the first language. And so therefore, oral translation can only be allowed in certain tests, and even then we can question how helpful that might be. Okay, another accommodation that's commonly suggested is, well, you can read the test directions or read the items aloud in English. So again, if you don't speak English well and you're having trouble reading it, if someone were to read it to you, would that necessarily help? Maybe, maybe not. But again, taking the example of that math question, if somebody simply read that aloud to you, would that be enough for you to be able to do the problem? No, because you really need to be able to read it yourself and then figure out all the different parts that need to be there. And again, if it was a reading comprehension exam and someone read the passage aloud to you, then read the questions to you, and then you indicated the answer, it's no longer a reading comprehension test. It's now an oral English comprehension test, okay, a listening test. So again, we can only use this in ways that don't change the construct of what's being measured. All right, another common accommodation is extra time. Okay, and the rationale here is if you're taking a test in your second language, you might need time to translate in your head, and then that could take a little bit of extra time. So if the test is timed, if we take away that time element, then you have all the time you need to be able to complete that test. The reality is that in most states, the tests are not timed anyways. The students have as much time as they need. So that's not really an accommodation that's given to ELLs that isn't already available for everyone else. And again, I would argue too that if you're simply at a low level of English proficiency, you can have all the time in the world, but just staring at those words and trying to translate in your head isn't going to help you figure out what it is if you don't know it in the first place. All right, and then finally, a very common accommodation is individual or small group administration. And so the idea here is let's take English language learners and let's put them in a situation where they're not in front of all their peers so that they feel less pressure. Maybe they're in a small room with their ESL teacher, or they're in a room by themselves with a bilingual person who can help them. Then they'll feel less embarrassed about asking for some of the other accommodations. So just giving them the test by themselves is not necessarily a good accommodation because it doesn't really address the linguistic issues. But if it does facilitate or make it easier for the student to ask for those other accommodations, then that might be a good thing. Okay, so those are some of the more common type of accommodations that are out there. I do want to note, though, that our understanding of testing accommodations and how to provide accommodations to English language learners in a way that's valid and reliable is still very problematic. So going back to the No Child Left Behind days, No Child Left Behind also required states to test English language learners in a valid and reliable manner and to provide those accommodations. And the states were going crazy because they didn't know how to do that. It was a very challenging thing to do. They didn't have the expertise they needed, and they were asking for help from the federal government, and the federal government was basically saying, well, sorry, figure it out yourself. So there's an interesting entity in the federal government called the Government Accountability Office, the GOA, and it's kind of an internal government watchdog so that when a federal agency is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, they will come in, they'll investigate, they'll issue a report, and they'll require to take some kind of investigative action. So this is exactly what happened in 2006. So this is after about 5 years of implementation of No Child Left Behind. States are really struggling with how to test English language learners. And so the GOA came in and they issued a report that really chastised the U.S. Department of Education because they were failing to help states figure out how to test ELLs in a valid, reliable manner. And so they said that you need to fix this. So the Department of Education went out, got a bunch of experts in English language learners and testing, etc., and they issued a report commissioned by the Department of Education titled Practical Guidelines for the Education of English Language Learners. And then one of the publications that came out of that group was specifically called Research-Based Recommendations for the Use of Accommodations in Large-Scale Assessments. Okay, that was published in 2006. It provided an extensive review of the academic research and the empirical research on testing accommodations and English language learners. So fantastic, right? They got the experts, they produced this report. The Department of Education placed this on their website, and then when states had questions, they would say, okay, look at the website and look at this report. Great. Well, here is the grand conclusion from that report from this group of experts, okay? And I read and I quote, "None of the accommodations examined has leveled the playing field for English language learners. Many accommodations currently in use across the country do not directly or indirectly address the linguistic needs of English language learners. At the same time, many of the linguistically appropriate accommodations that have been studied empirically were found in this review to have little or no impact on the test performance of English language learners." Okay? So, what was the grand conclusion from this group of experts? To provide guidance to states and how to test English language learners in a valid and reliable manner? We don't know. The research doesn't tell us. We don't have research yet that tells us how to do this. So the bottom line, we do not know how to test English language learners and on large-scale assessments in a valid and reliable manner. We do not know what accommodations work, what accommodations don't work, how they invalidate tests, etc. There is research ongoing in this effort. We've made little progresses here and there, but by and large, this problem has not gone away. And so even as we move now from No Child Left Behind to the ELLS Every Student Succeeds Act, this problem is still there. Okay? And so we have a lot of work to do in this area. All right, thank you.